again. Welcome to this session, the Panel 12, Military Occupation, Sexual Violence Against Women in Timor-Leste, a search for historical justice and healing. My name is Akihisa Matsuno. I serve as the facilitator of this session today. I think some of you may know me already. I've been doing research on Timor-Leste and Indonesia for many years, and I almost going to retire now. And then I worked for the UNAMET in 1999 and worked for the CAVR, Truth Commission in Timor-Leste, 2003, 2004. And then now I regularly go to Timor to do research on various issues, especially on this comfort women issue together with my partner, Kyoko Furusawa, and the Association HAC, human rights organization in Dili, and so on. Today, we have a lot of presentations like this. We have 6 speakers today, so it's a very crowded session and packed. So I hope everybody keeps time, and we want to finish within 2 hours plus perhaps 15 minutes or so, including discussion at the end. So without further ado, I want to start my presentation, and then Kyoko Furusawa and Maria Manuela Leon Pereira follow. And then we want to have a break, 10 minutes. And then Leonard Okefi talks about decolonizing gender. And then Eriko Ikeda Mina Watanabe spent 20 minutes talking about the international dimension of the sexual slavery issue. I think everybody has put your microphone mute. So when you have a question, well, we want to have a question and answer time at the end of the session after all these presentation. And but if you have a question, please do so via chat, and we receive questions in chat, and then I give microphone to the speakers to answer. Okay, my presentation, the Japanese military sexual slavery system as a policy, violence against women as a policy of military occupation. Before I go into our research on the wartime sexual slavery issue in Timor-Leste, I want to introduce a message of Chanel Guzmão that he sent to the United Nations in 1982, because it had a great impact on us, the Japanese activists on Timor. He said, "We remind the Japanese government that we still carry the scars of the injuries caused by the massacres, tortures, imprisonment, violations of all types, and the ruin of our country caused during 3 years of occupation by the criminal and the vandal assassins. Today, these scars have become ulcerous. The Maori people drink the pus of the wounds caused by the Japanese aggressors in the very recent past. Today, you forget to cure these injuries." But this is the message of Chanel Guzmão to the United Nations General Assembly in 1982. Then there was a testimony by Mr. Shuhachi Iwamura, a Japanese soldier stationed in Timor. Later, I will talk about that a little bit. And he wrote a chronology of his military career, and in that he wrote that he constructed a comfort station in Bagia. There was also a testimony of Mr. and Mrs. Maya from Darwin, who came to Japan, about sexual violence by Japanese troops. So knowing these testimonies, we were determined that once Timor-Leste has achieved independence, we would like to do research on the crimes perpetrated by the military of our country. So this is a map of Japanese invasion and occupation of Portuguese Timor. As you know, Japan invaded Portuguese Timor on 20 February 1942 and occupied it for 3.5 years. The purpose of this occupation was to drive out Australian soldiers from the island and build up a defense line against Australia. Portugal was a neutral country, and this caused a particular problem to the Japanese authorities. Japan justified the invasion by saying that Portuguese neutrality had been effectively lost, breached, with the landing of the Allied forces of Australia and the Netherlands 2 months before, on 17 December 1941. But Japan said it would respect Portuguese sovereignty, but confined Portuguese residents in the internment camps in Likisa and Mabara, and placed the whole island under its military control. The origins of the comfort station system. By that time, the Japanese military comfort station system had been well established. The origin of the system goes back to the first Sino-Japanese War or Shanghai incident of 1932, in which the Japanese force clashed with the Chinese force. Before that, Japanese soldiers stationed outside Japan, namely Manchuria, had been provided sexual brothels around military barracks. The reasons of the military's decision to develop its own system of sexual slavery were first, to stop rape incidents by soldiers, second, to prevent the spread of sexual diseases within the military, and third, to keep soldiers away from women spies. Systematic provision of sexual service was also deemed useful to maintain morale of soldiers. The military's comfort station system quickly expanded in China after the Second Sino-China War broke out in 1937. To gather women, the military initially entrusted private agents to openly recruit waitresses in Japan and its colonies, Korea, Taiwan. Chinese women were also mobilized in the front lines in China. The methods of recruitment were rough, and young girls were often threatened, deceived, or even kidnapped. The system developed into machinery that involved both civilian and military authorities at various stages of the process, such as recruitment, issuance of visas, transportation, medical checks, security and management of facilities, and control of women. As Japan invaded Southeast Asia in early 1942, the military's comfort station system was spread to its occupied areas. For the purpose of comparison, it is useful to look at how it was in the Netherlands East Indies, Indonesia, that Japan occupied together with the Portuguese Timor. Basically, wherever Japanese troops stayed, there were comfort stations. But the mode of management varied from place to place depending on availability of facilities and professional managers. In major cities such as Batavia, there were officers' clubs run by businessmen and used exclusively by officers. There were also comfort stations for ordinary soldiers. Both types operated with a license from the military. Indonesians, Koreans, Chinese, and in some places Dutch women were mobilized, often forcibly or through deceptions. In rural areas of the outer islands, the military's involvement was much more direct, as it was difficult to find professional brothel managers in remote and dangerous areas. In rural areas, commander class officers had their own women in their residences or shared one or more women. Meanwhile, for rank and file soldiers, the unit utilized existing buildings or constructed temporary huts with bamboos or palm leaves. Women were gathered from surrounding villages, sometimes by way of abducting. There was also what can be more properly called as rape centers, where girls in the neighborhood were regularly ordered to come to serve soldiers. The military sexual slavery in Portuguese Timor seems to be very close to the one in the rural areas in the eastern region of the Netherlands East Indies. When the Japanese troops landed on Portuguese Timor, one of the early demands of the Japanese to the Portuguese authorities was women. Portuguese governor at the time, Manuel de Carvalho, in his post-war report, wrote how the Japanese demanded him to bring back prostitutes who fled to the mountains to Dili. When the Japanese demanded more women, he refused. He wrote, the Japanese solved the problem by bringing Korean women from outside. The governor does not write the Portuguese women were taken by the Japanese, but as it is already known that the Dutch women were forced into sexual slavery in the Dutch East Indies, we cannot exclude possibilities of Portuguese women taken by the Japanese military. At least the Japanese military tried to take Portuguese women too. A Portuguese official who was interned in the camp told Australian war crimes investigator Major Kinton that the Japanese demanded chef de posto of Lekisa, where the concentration camp was, to hand over Portuguese girls to them. The chef de posto refused, he said. But according to an eyewitness account, there were at least 3 comfort stations in Dili, one with Korean women, one with Indonesian women, and one with Timorese women. The comfort station with Timorese women was located behind where the Dili branch of the ANZ Bank was until some time ago. Chef de Succo of Motael at the time told the investigator, Major Kinton, that when he was ordered to find girls for the Japanese, he sent 2 old women, and the Japanese said they were no good. From the Japanese side, there are quite number of accounts by former soldiers. I already mentioned Shohachi Iwamura's account. From memoirs of other former soldiers, it is evident that the comfort stations existed in Dili, Osu, Lauten, and some other places. From Timorese witness accounts, we know that there were comfort stations in all present-day municipalities except Oikusi, Lekisa, Manatutu, where we still have to find some more information. Accounts by Timorese women and men. Accounts by Timorese survivors and witnesses have accumulated since 2000. In that year, as part of the preparations for the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal, 2 groups in Timor-Leste, the Lawyers Association and Women Organization for Pels, collected testimonies. Accounts by Timorese clearly indicate that there was direct and systematic involvement of the military from the recruitment to management of comfort stations. And the mobilization of women in most cases involved coercion, threats, violence. Sometimes girls became pregnant because soldiers did not use condoms in violation of the rules. The wartime experiences left physical and psychological injuries on the women, and in some cases made a great negative impact on their life after the war. These injuries and impact have not gone yet after 75 years. Punishments. What happened if people refuse to hand over women to the Japanese military, or if women refuse to go? The Japanese severely punished those who collaborated with the Australians, rebelled against the Japanese, or did not obey orders of the Japanese. They also punished those who committed criminal acts such as theft. They sometimes executed captured Australian soldiers and suspicious Chinese residents. The Japanese soldiers often threatened to kill if women refused to come, or parents refused to hand over their daughters. We suspect the 2 cases are related with the sexual slavery. One is the execution of Liurai Marcelo of Caminasa Suai, Cavalima. His attendant at the time is a direct eyewitness of the execution. Liurai Marcelo, coming back from home from the Japanese military post, told his wife, Hermina, that he was ordered to hand over women to the Japanese, but that he wanted to refuse. Then he was called to the military post in Bobonaro and he was executed. And this was witnessed by his attendant. The other case is Liurai Duarte Lakaba village, Lauten. Liurai Duarte sent his 2 sisters to the Japanese, but later he went to the military post and asked them to return the sisters. But his request was refused and he was harassed. After coming back home, he hanged himself from a tamarind tree in the garden at midnight. His wife also tried to kill her by stabbing her belly, but she did not die. Duarte's younger brother then became the Liurai of Lakawa, and he collaborated with the Japanese, but unfortunately, because of that, Portugal arrested him and sent him to Atauro after the war. And then there are talks about collaboration. The comfort station in Marovo village, Bobonaro, was a well-known place with hot springs We can imagine how enthusiastic Japanese soldiers were about the mountain resort. But it was a hell for the girls who were brought there. One Timorese Liurai played a key role here. He was the Liurai and chef de sucre of Lasaon village, Ermera, at the time. Initially, he worked for the Organ Authority, or Special Intelligence Unit attached to the Navy. Then he returned to his village and worked for the Japanese units in Bobonaro. He was the one who recruited women for the comfort station in Marobo, and also Oat. After the war, he was exiled to Atauro, but he escaped to Alor first and then to Indonesia and settled down in Atambua. He died there in 2003. From these stories, we understand that which way you choose, refusing orders or collaborating with the Japanese, it was hell waiting for you. The impact the Japanese occupation left on the Timorese society was probably huge, but we are yet to know exactly how huge and extensive it was. So as a conclusion, I want to say one thing is very clear. The historical issues between Timor-Leste and Japan have not been properly dealt with. Victims are still alive. It isn't too late to do justice and to restore dignity to the victims. And how to do it and what is the condition of justice at the moment, I want to give this issue to the next speaker, Kyoko Furusawa. So Kyoko, please.
Thanks, Eki. May I share my
okay.
slides?
Yes. I want to introduce Kyoko Furusawa to the audience. Kyoko worked with me to do research on the comfort of women issue since 2000. She is a professor of economics at the university in Tokyo, and she was involved in the solidarity movement for many years, and she served also secretary to the Diet Members Forum, parliamentarians group for East Timor in Japan. And she was also attached to the Gender Equality Promotion Office of the Prime Minister in Timor in 2003-04. So now, Kyoko, you have floor.
Hello, everybody. My name is Kyoko, and I am one of old veteran members of Japanese Solidarity Movement for Timor-Leste. So today, I am very glad to be given this opportunity to have a discussion about the post-conflict and post-colonial situation of gender justice with you. Can you see my slide? Can you hear me? Aki, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear. I think everybody
Okay.
can hear.
Yep. The withdrawal of Indonesian military in October 1999 brought about liberation for the East Timorese and created space for seeking truth of the past wartime sexual violence. But the basis was already there in the period of Timorese national resistance. Many East Timorese women's activists had raised their voice against the sexual violence by Indonesian soldiers in the resistance. And the activists of international solidarity movement has supported them. Sexual violence by Japanese military and Indonesian military had common problems such as the systematic nature of violence, lack of understanding and discrimination in societies, and survivors' physical and psychological damages, abandoned children, and impunity. In 1990s was a decade of speaking out for the victims, starting with Kim Hak-soon of South Korea, followed by many others from the Philippines, Taiwan, China, and Indonesia. East Timorese added their voices as the latest comer after they have achieved national liberation. My task here is based on the survivors' tellings from their perspectives to shed a light on some facts on the Japanese military sexual slavery system in Timor-Leste and to question the situation of justice since post-World War II up to post-independence of Timor-Leste. As Matsuno already presented, it's clear also from the memoir of former Japanese soldiers that gathering women was part of the military's logistical work. The operation was systematic. For example, military doctors examined women for sexual diseases, and the military provided soldiers with condoms as long as they are available. But neither such documents of soldiers nor the report of the Portuguese governors writes about the fear, the pain, or anger that the victims had to endure. Here is a huge gap, and it must be filled. Servitude under the system. So far, we have been able to receive from 21 survivors, 21 testimonies from testimonies from 21 survivors about their experiences of sexual violence by Japanese soldiers. 12 of them have already passed away. The Japanese military ordered the village chiefs or leaders to collaborate to mobilize and control the people. There are two types of victims of the Japanese military sexual slavery. One is comfort women at comfort station. The other is women monopolized by a particular officer. Comfort women at comfort station would receive any soldiers and many at one night. In Bobonaro, Marta Rubele was put into a comfort station in Malabo, and Inés Magalhães Gonçalves and Madalena de Jesus into another in Oato. Three were girls and had not had menstruation yet. They were first mobilized for road construction and were later forced to become a comfort women. In Kobarima too, where Japanese military mobilized local population for road construction, Clementina Cardozo and Geralda Cardozo were forced to become a comfort women. Laurinda Ferreira was also put into a comfort station in Swai. She was given a Japanese name, Tazuko, and had the name tattooed in the kanji characters on her arm. Francisca Macedo was named Tomiko, and was forced to work at a comfort station in Swai too. In Bacau, Salada Silva fled to the mountain with other girls when Japanese troops reached there. She bundled her hair and blackened her face with charcoal so that her face looked like a boy. But after all, she was captured and put into a comfort station in Daragada. In the military, ranks decide everything, and sexual exploitation was not an exception. Officers were allowed to have one or more women as their own sexual slave. Esmeralda Boe was a girl from the village of Memo Bobonaro. She was monopolized by an officer with the name of Shimomura. When Shimomura left, she was handed over to Haraku and then to Kawano. In the town of Bobonaro, Maria Rosa Fernanda Noronha was forced to serve Ohara first and then Taniyama after Ohara left. In Manu Fahi, Margarita Hornai was monopolized by an officer Komaki in Kiras. In Same, Virginia da Costa had to serve three officers, Luis, Saho, and Tanone. And Adicia Plego was taken by Takaraki. In the coastal town of Betano, Palmia Paiseko was monopolized by Ono. In Bikeke, Jose Asinsoko's mother, named Naimau, was monopolized by Hirata. She gave birth to Jose Asinsoko after the war. In Uado Carabao, Esperanza Almeida Fernandez was monopolized by an officer with the nickname of Matahari. Many of these women would not only serve sexual desire of Japanese military men. During the day, they had to work for construction of roads or barracks, to plant vegetables, to pound sago, to prepare meals, or to wash clothes. The condition of comfort station in Delhi are not just clear, but comfort station in the rural areas were generally in a very poor condition. Many survivors said that they were not given money, clothes, nor the other necessary things. Even food were not enough. The Japanese troops themselves could rarely receive supplies after their supply lines were cut by Australian air raid. The survivors said that their family brought them cassava or corn from home. The method of mobilization was systematic. The Japanese disarmed the Portuguese force and interned Portuguese residents into camps. Thus, no one could stop the Japanese from hunting down women. In such a situation, the Japanese military ordered Liulais, village chiefs, and Timor-Leste assistants of Japanese military called Pombera to collect women. These local men were punished if the women escaped. They had to bring them back. One typical phrase that Liulai village chiefs or Pombera used when they had to persuade women was, the Japanese military, they will kill your parents or they will kill us. Village chiefs and Liulai could not refuse orders of the Japanese military, but there were some who did. For example, as Aki mentioned already, Liulai Marcelo and Liulai Helmus refused to hand over women, and they were executed in public at the military post of Bobonaro. When Jose Ashinsoko's mother was demanded by a Japanese, Liulai tries to protect her, telling a lie that she was his wife. But when the soldiers knew it was a lie, they punished the Liulai by sitting on the sharp stones, bending their knees. Some women made an attempt to escape. Alicia Prego was raped by Takaraki, and when Takaraki fell asleep, she escaped in blood-soaked clothes. But a Liulai came to pick her up upon orders from the Japanese. The family of Margarita Holnai let her go hiding, but the Japanese held her mother and brother and tortured them by fire and by standing under the sun. So she had no choice but to return. Japanese soldiers did not understand how much women suffered from the intensive and long-time exposure to sexual violence. Ines Magarians said, soldiers were just as savage and brutally mounted us. Even animals would be better treated. We were not only forced to have sex, but were also ordered to entertain them by singing and dancing. I feel like becoming crazy. Ines gave birth to a baby at the comfort station when Japanese troops were to leave. When Japanese troops were to leave, they took away that baby from her. The baby was only 3 months old. Malta Bere once resisted because serving many soldiers were so hard and painful. That soldier lifted her body by grabbing her neck. Malta said to us, men too are born from women. Why can they do cruel things like this? We were so tired after working under the hot sun during the day. Women also get tired as men do. Women also get sick as men do. Women also have dignity as men have. When a man is born, it's never like falling down from the heaven. Both women and men are born through the women's wombs. And trauma, discrimination, and abandoned child. After the war ended, the Japanese military went back home and Portuguese rules returned. However, the victims continues to suffer from the physical and psychological injuries, damages. They also encountered lack of sympathy and discrimination. Gerardo Cardozo returned to her village after suffering for 3 years at 3 comfort stations. What she met in her village was slanders. Margarita Olnay, who surrendered because her family members were tortured, experienced the same in her village. Esmeralda Boye, although she looked strong-minded, she always anxious about how other people saw her. When villagers were chatting and one of them looked at her, she became upset. She thought they might be saying Esmeralda was a woman of Japanese soldiers. After she testified at that tribunal, women's tribunal in Japan, she did not feel like that anymore, she said. As for Lin Yin, she married after the war, but one day the husband left her and their daughters without leaving a message and thing. She had never told her husband that she was a comfort woman. She suspects that she left because someone told her husband about her past. Laurindo Ferreira hates sexual intercourses as a result of her experience as a comfort woman, and therefore could not marry after war. Among the married survivors we met, 4 did not have a child. One of them, Alicia Prego, now lives with 2 daughters. They are daughters from her husband's temporary marriage with her younger sister. Alicia suspects that she could not have a child because she was repeatedly raped when she was a child. She was a girl. Esperanza Almendra Fernandez had not experienced menstruation yet when she was picked up by a Japanese officer in Wat Kalabao. She doesn't remember much about the officer, Matahari, because she never had a meal with him. Her foods were usually brought by her parents. What she does remember about him is a word, kwa, which like ayu is used when you blame someone in Japanese. After the war, she was detained by the Portuguese authorities as she was suspected to be a collaborator with Japanese. She was detained in Iriomar for 3 months and was taken to Lauten, then to Bacau, where she was interrogated. In Lauten, as there was no water to drink, she grovelled on the ground and sipped water like a paddle from a paddle like a dog. She was beaten when she cried. After all, she was released because she found that she did not get any privilege, anything like clothes from the Japanese. She cannot forget that. She said she cannot forget that humiliation she received at the time. Children born out of relation with Japanese soldiers too have experienced stigmatization and bullying. People often ask them, are you Timorese or Japanese? Their fathers did not leave anything that indicated their names or addresses in Japan. Impunity and absence of justice. How were Japanese crimes tried after the war? Stating the conclusion first, no Japanese was punished for ill treatment, abuse, of Timorese, including sexual violence against women. Only those Timorese who have accused to have collaborated with the Japanese were punished. The Allied powers opened a post-war tribunal in Darwin to try Japanese Class B and Class C war crimes in Timor and some other areas. But the Darwin Tribunal did not prosecute even a single case of ill treatment of local people in Portuguese Timor. The cases from Portuguese Timor was only ill treatment of Australian prisoners of war, POW. Jeffrey Gunn points out that one reason for this was the Portuguese colonial government's refusal to cooperate with war crimes investigation of the Allied powers. Portugal did not tell Australian investigators the names of the collaborators with Japanese. Although Portugal did not cooperate with war crime investigation, it did give severe punishment to realize and village chiefs who allegedly collaborated with Japanese. Many were exiled to Atauro, where they died because of harsh conditions there or arbitrary punishment. Portugal apparently tried to negotiate with Japan over war reparations compensation, but later at some point it gave up negotiating. So we can say that post-war reparation for Timor-Leste still remains unsolved. Then how to do the Japanese and the Timor-Leste governments deal with the problem after Timor-Leste's independence? Sorry to say that the independence of Timor-Leste did not change this unjust situation. The victims demand the Japanese government to restore their dignity through an official apology and compensations. However, when Japan and Timor-Leste established a diplomatic relation in 2002, both governments agreed to go with the future-oriented spirit. Since then, the Timor-Leste government never mentions Japan's war responsibility. Zeram Sota, when he was a foreign minister, linked the Japan's post-war reparations with the issue of Indonesia's reparations. He argues that raising the issue of reparation with Japan would open up a Pandora's box, leading to a popular demand to Indonesia for reparations. If that happens, it is inconvenient from a viewpoint of security and economic stability for East Timor. The Timor-Leste government even did not try to apply the Asian Women's Fund. This is a Japanese private, not public framework to distribute financial assistance to the survivors. The fund still existed at the time of Timor-Leste independence. As for the Timor-Leste government, there has been no measure aimed at the victims of wartime sexual violence of Japanese. Meanwhile, Japanese diplomats repeat that Japan would not do anything unless Timor-Leste government raises the issue. Sorry. Esperanza Almeida Fernandez says, our body was treated just like a horse or a water buffalo. The soldiers never came to Timor-Leste voluntarily. It was the state that sent them here. So the state has to solve that problem. When we visited Malta Bere in August 2006, she could hardly move as her right side of the body was paralyzed after a stroke. She couldn't excrete without being held by someone else. She said, I'm now like a baby, she laughed. But she could make a sarcastic remark, such as I'm dying soon, the Japanese government has very little time to repent of their deed. We believe Japan should fulfill its responsibility regardless of the position of the Timor-Leste government. The two women were angry. Their anger is aimed at both men's violence and state violence against women. It is also aimed at acts of omission or absence of repentance for such acts. With whatever logic the government of Japan and Timor-Leste justifies their act of omission, the pains of the victims do not disappear. Their angers never fade away. We see at the core of their anger exists a persistent search for justice. They suffered, but they were not beaten. In front of us stands a huge wall of injustice. To break the wall, we continue to work with our partner, the Hack Association. Our activities include assistance to the survivors, the publication of a book in Tibetan, and promotion of history education from a gender perspective in collaboration with school teachers and university professors, and advocacy directed at both governments. Finally, I want to finish my presentation by calling on a participant, especially participant from Portugal, to join our research on the Japanese occupation period, as well as on its aftermath, in order to achieve a just solution for the survivors. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kyoko. So we have heard two presentations about the Japanese military sexual slavery system during the wartime. And now we turn to Manuela Pereira on the current situation of survivors of sexual violence from the Indonesian time. So Manuela, are you ready? Can you share the screen? So can you put on microphone?
Yeah.
Manuela, so Maria Manuela Leon Pereira. I give you a brief introduction. Manuela is a well-known expert of gender field and also activist with human rights for a long time, since the 1990s. And we have known her since she was working for the Focal Pairs. And then we collaborated for some time to do research on the comfort of women too. And then and she worked for the International Center for Transitional Justice program in Timor-Leste. And now she is the director of the ACBIT, Association Shegaba Ita. It's an organization to care women survivors from sexual violence during the Indonesian times. So now, Manuela, so you can speak, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm very grateful for this opportunity given to me to give a presentation at the conference. And a big thank you to you, to everyone who listening to my presentation. Yeah, during the conflict, women and men experienced various kinds of violence. Men mostly became targets of violence, such as killings, disappearances, torture, imprisonment, and so on. Women also experienced violence like men, but there were other forms of violence that was more directed towards women, such as sexual violence, forced marriage, and sexual slavery. The CAVR identified 3 common forms of sexual slavery. First pattern, the women were held inside military installation where ownership in these cases was either individual or collective. Women could be raped by one repeat offender or by a group of offenders. The second involved a pattern of summoning women to the military compound for sexual abuse by soldiers. Often these women's names were on a list that were handed over between rotating military battalions. The third pattern whereby a soldier unilaterally moves into the house and demands to be treated like husband. I also want to share about 2 quotes from 2 survivors. We were taking us to Malima and held for 1 month, then to Hotel Flamboyant, where all of us, 31, including 4 women, were detained in 1 cell with no room to walk or lie down for 6 months. I was interrogated and tortured. Every night we were taken out and sexually abused. I was tortured with cigarettes on my touch and still has the scars. This is one survivor from Baucau. Another survivor from Hermeras told about the experience in Hatulia in 1977, when the commander of battalion 145 threatened to shoot her brother with a gun in order to force her to go to the TNI post. She said that they used me as a prostitute for 1 year until eventually I gave birth to a child. At the time, I was still a young girl. Also, she said my name was on the coding list as a person who could be used. So with every rotation, I would always be picked by a member of ABI who wanted me. I always submitted to them because I feared for my life. This is a survivor from Hermera. How the CAVR or the rape talk about as a crimes against humanity, because according to the 2 commissions, CAVR, of this 95 indictment of the serious crimes trials, more than 300 defendants, it's 80% of in Indonesia, and only 6 stated rape as a crimes against humanity. And only 1 case resulted in a conviction, namely Lolotoy case. But we know that after only 83 foreign militia had been convicted, but soon later were released due to the pardon from the president. We also know that the CAVR documented 853 charges, including case of sexual assault, sexual slavery, and various cases of violence. Now, how about the CAVR and CTF recommendation? We see that from CAVR recommendation clearly mention about some recommendation that relevant for women, like reparation program should earmark 50% resources for women victims. They also recommended reparation for survivors of gender-based violence, to widows, single mothers, and also another national program national campaign to carry out on violence against women, and there must be national commitment to end sex violence. Another thing about memorialization and also a national reparation program, memorialization. But if we see from the CPF recommendation also mentioned about the creation and of a comprehensive national reparation program for victims of the conflict from 1975 to 1999. And from CPF also clearly recommended to formally support the national reparation program in Timor-Leste for victims of the conflict 1975 to 1999. And another important thing, to contribute funds to such a program. But if we see the reality, the fact that the reparation, recommendation about the reparation not happened yet until now. Okay. Now, how about the current situation of women victims? We have this question: does truth bring justice? Because after 20 years since the national liberation, women's victims and survivors are still struggling to fill their daily needs until now. They still endure discrimination and marginalization, and they are still waiting for justice and the assistance that they urgently need. Women victims of sexual violence continue to experience new violence, domestic violence, precisely because they are victims of sexual violence. They are getting older, suffer health problems, and find it increasingly difficult to get good care because they live in remote areas. Many victims and survivors of sexual violence face multiple layers of discrimination from their families, from neighboring communities, the traditional communities, and even from public institutions. One example is discrimination in obtaining important documents such as property rights for inherited lands, where the women have to give up the right to the land left by their husband when they remarry or they marry again, or if the child is a result of forced marriage or sexual slavery. One women from survivors from Los Palos said that my child is always good. People say, his friend said, hey, child of the TNI, go to your country. And she also has a daughter, and she said that my daughter has a girl, but her boyfriend doesn't want to marry her because she considered as a descendant of the TNI soldiers. Women victims and survivors are often excluded from support programs of the government. They cannot access healthcare, education for their children, psychosocial programs, or economic empowerment. Many of them also excluded for the pension scheme for veterans because they don't fulfill the requirement. As we know that one of the requirement made them difficult because they have to show the witnesses that mainly men don't know about them, or they don't know about what the contribution was done by the women before, because they know the man, they know the husband. One survivor from BKK mentioned about how the pension had give the consequences, not good thing, but consequences became worse from her. She said, I got the pension because of my husband. Because of that, many of my husband family members came and live with me so that they could eat from my husband's pension. I have two daughters who are children of Indonesian army. One of them is a child with disability. My husband's family said that my children had no right to support by the pension. It's like how these women uh, got other the new discrimination and continue to have children. Okay. Some children born of rape, they also have difficulty obtaining birth certificates because they don't know their father's name. They demand to write down the names of their father and grandparents in order to obtain birth certificates has made it difficult for them. Okay. In our research launched in last year, found that only 16 of 77 participants mentioned about assessing in any way of a justice mechanism for the violation that they were experienced. This is research that we made for 77 survivors. Access to justice was extremely limited for victims of the armed conflict. Just for women in total had participated in any of the transitional justice mechanisms implemented after the Indonesian occupation ended. These 4 women has provided their testimony to truth-seeking processes. Not a single participant in this research attained criminal justice for the crimes against humanity. And they had been victims between 75 to 1999. One survivor from Kovalima said, "I'm still hurt. It still hurts me because I was raped and all the information went to the tribunal, like serious crimes unit at the time, but the man who did it is still free to this day. It's been 18 years, but he hasn't been delivered a suspended sentence from the court or sent to the prison. So when I think back to what happened back then, it's agony. Yeah, agony. She still feels very, very painful. And what's government efforts to respond to Shega recommendation? We know that from our organization has supported by MSSI since 2010 until 2017 and 2019. But however, there is no binding law or decree yet. This is for sustainability. We can say that this is not secure. Government also supported the facilitation cost for visiting children who are now adults to meet the families in Timor-Leste through MSSI and CNC. I think one important thing since the establishment of Centro Nacional Shega has demonstrated its tenacity, the innovation in dissemination Shega report, preserving memory, and promoting learning about the past, efforts of memorialization in collaboration with Victims Association to commemorate a significant event and sites of the massacre in all districts. Although not many efforts have been made as to acknowledgement and recovery for women's victims and survivors of the past conflict. Associação Chega Beta, my organization, we have done many things how to strengthening women survivors and victims from the past conflict. We established to ensure that the recommendation in the CABR report were not forgotten, to educate the people of Timor-Leste about the findings recommendation. We also strengthen victims and survivors through trauma healing, leadership training, economic empowerment, and connecting them with the social and services and involvement in lobbying and campaign activities for their rights. Our approach with these victims and survivors is through participatory action research methods, using methods that in our discussion, we can discuss about the problem they face, sharing the solution they have used to solve the problems with other friends, and linking women survivors with the past conflict with women victims of domestic violence in building trust and stronger bonds for women's movement. ACBIT also conducted outreach about the Shega report to students through school visit, comic book, and mobile exhibition, and also the important theme, gathering stories and building a database for advocacy. Yeah, I think this is information like that since 2013 until 2019, we have documented stories of 501 women victims, including information about their current lives. Most of them experienced sexual violence from members of the military and Indonesian militia who supported them. The ACBIT database has documented 234 cases of rape, sexual slavery, forced marriage, and other forms of sexual violence. Yeah. To finish my presentation, just want to share key lessons and recommendations that work to improve access to social services for women victims in Timor-Leste must continue to be supported and must expand their focus to support women victims and survivors of conflict, especially victims of sexual violence. It should be reviewed to ensure they are inclusive of women victims of conflict, but also for the few survivors of sexual violence from the Japanese occupation period, like Aki and Kyo have mentioned before, who they are still few and their situation is very vulnerable. In terms of meeting their specific needs and referring them to appropriate services. The government, through the Minister of Social Solidarity and Inclusion, has so far allocated a large amount of money for women's shelters in the district, Mamaho, let's say. It is hoped that it should be redesigned to become community-based trauma support centers for women's victims of domestic violence and victims from the conflict. Another thing that access to justice program should include advocacy for land and inheritance right for women, especially widows and single mothers, as well the protection from discrimination. The establishment of Centros Nacional Chega for us is a victory. After waiting for a long time, CNC as one of the government organs, CNC must take on a proactive role to ensure the implementation of CAVR recommendation for women survivors of gender-based violence, including facilitating them to access assistance from the government, taking immediate steps to ensure that their children are provided with their citizens' papers and are able to access scholarship for documentation as well as financial assistance for livelihood project. The hope of obtaining formal justice for the victim has gone farther and farther. when there is no good political will from the state. But it's very important to give recognition to victims to past conflicts, that their cases are recognized as serious crimes, because this is to avoid total impunity, anxiety, and anger, and support is needed in the process of reintegration and reconciliation at the local level. When the perpetrator resides in or returns to the community where the victims lives. Lastly, I think that civil societies, CNC, and survivors should review the existing legal framework for justice and assistance for victims, exploring how a gender interpretation of rape as torture may allow some women survivors of gender-based violence to access veterans funds also. Because this is like to develop, to make clear policies and ongoing trainings for national and district level official issuance for issue citizens paper. I think this is some important thing that we feel, we think that this is a key lesson to improve for the future, for the life of the victims for conflict, particularly for the victims of sexual violence. I think this is for me. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Manuela. So now we understand the sexual violence, including sexual slavery issue, is a long time issue and a persistent issue from the olden times to contemporary age. The one thing is very clear, that the authorities after the war, after the conflict, because in both cases, the perpetrators are basically outsiders. But when they left, the authorities after the war, after the conflict, failed to address these issues properly, and society is not really aware of these issues. And in the end, no effective measures have been taken so far. Okay, now we want to have a break, but I think we have to reduce the time to 5 minutes. Initially, I said we can have 10 minutes break, but now I want to have it only 5 minutes. Now, thanks to the presenters, we started 10 minutes late, but we are only behind the time, 15 minutes behind the time. So we are still doing well, I guess. So please come back here after 5 minutes, and we hear three more speakers. Thank you. For those who have nothing to do at the moment, maybe I can entertain you a little bit. I'm sitting in front of one picture drawn by famous painter Taiko Tomiyama. You can see here the skeletons, dead bodies, and dead men wearing Japanese military costumes. So this symbolizes the dark side of the Japanese war period. So the title is Illusions Under the Sakura Tree. ちょっとこんな感じで。I sitting together with the Mina and Eriko, three of us a kind of broadcasting from the satellite room of the WAM. But this is a map of comfort stations all over Asia. So we have a permanent exhibit here about the comfort women. And there are also staff working on documentation and so on. So if you have an opportunity to come to Tokyo, you can drop by here. This museum is a private organization, it's kind of an NGO working on the issue of comfort women. It's located in the area called Waseda. Waseda, maybe you remember, it's a famous private university, big university, and the surrounding area is famous for various kinds of activities. It's a center of young activism in Japan, and it's a student town. So there are lots of cheap restaurants around here. So it's a very good place. It's very, very lively place, I have to say. But now the COVID-19 is making it very different. But I think that people are coming back in October. October, we have to start a new semester. Okay, now 5:24. I think we want to start again. Kulionas, are you ready? Oh, yes. So after hearing the stories about the historical facts and issues from Japanese time and Indonesian time and the current situation of women survivors of the sexual violence from both periods, we want to expand this session to a little bit wider context. Kuliona's okay if he, is my pronunciation correct? She's from Ireland and she spent well over 4 years in Timor-Leste, mostly in Lauten. And she has finished PhD in 2017. And she has just finished working for the International Rescue Committee. So she's been working in various places, Iraq, Timor-Leste, and so on gender issues. She will give us the context in which the sexual violence issue has been should be discussed. I said the perpetrators are outsiders, basically Japanese soldiers and Indonesian soldiers. But why this issue remains unresolved and continues to be an issue to this day, suddenly we have to look at the factors inside the Timorese society too, and it is that aspect that the Kulionas will be talking about. And then after that we go back to the comfort women issue, and then we two speakers will talk about the international dimension of the movement. So Kulionas, can you start?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so thank you very much, Kisa, for your introduction. Thank you also to the participants and everybody else who's come to listen to me talk, which is from a small village in the southwest of Ireland called Baltimore. It's very sleepy at the moment. So the title, or I retitled my paper, which of course is a draft paper, it's a paper in the making, called Decolonizing Gender in the Search for Historical Justice and Healing Post-Independence. So my paper today presents qualitative solidarity-based research, exploring Timorese women's experiences of gender, gain insights into the potential for historical justice and healing post-independence. Broadly speaking, my research aims to contribute towards an adequately and contextualized understanding of gender that can inform development policy and interventions seeking to bring about gender justice. The dual objectives of my study were to deconstruct universal framings of gender and at the same time create space for women's perspectives to shape knowledge from within their own epistemological lenses. By presenting women's routine experiences of relations of domination, deprivation, and gendered violence, my paper raises questions about the current meaning of self-determination for daily life. What has the period of independence in Timor-Leste brought to women's autonomy? How are decolonial processes transforming patriarchal institutions that might be standing or that are considered standing in the way of historical justice and healing? My paper today works on assumptions the right to self-determination cannot be exercised without gender justice and the restructuring of all relations of domination that include gender violence and structural violence. Failure to do so sustains the structural inequalities that cause the violence in the first instance, limiting women's safety, freedom and autonomy and inhibiting their authority and capabilities compared to men. It is now agreed that mainstream international development policies and interventions imposed in settings emerging from colonialism and violent conflict are failing to challenge systems of domination. This is maintaining structural inequalities they claim to address. Furthermore, understandings of gender harms and power relations remain both incomplete and overlooked, despite the wealth of feminist scholarship and women's own articulations of relations of dominance that is prevalent in their lives. For example, rather than it being holistic and relational, gender and development, known as GAD, policy interventions such as gender mainstreaming, often follow fragmented and individualistic approaches. This depoliticizes gender, with the result that key issues for women, including inconvenient realities of their family and married lives, tend to get neglected. And sidelining complex hierarchies or keeping, for example, women's poverty and unpaid labour, domestic violence off the policy table neglects structural problems underlying gender inequality. This leads to avoidable failure of public policy to transform gender roles, relations, and identities. Clarifying the meaning of gender is therefore critical if analysis is to inform policy intended to transform women's lives or their lived realities. In what follows, I briefly consider the concept of self-determination found within decolonial feminist thinking. Questioning the usefulness of imposing ready-made Western concepts in non-Western settings, decolonial feminist thought prioritizes the specific departure point from which women speak out and struggle for economic and social rights, and offer their understandings of the logic of power. Arnfred argues that despite the end of colonial rule, the lines of thinking introduced by colonial power continue after independence, such that colonialism maintains a lasting hold over oppressed people. More specifically, fully emerged within local context, the ongoing gendered effects of colonialism, termed as the coloniality of gender, oppress people through the intersection of gender, race, and class that maintains the structure of power. Decolonial feminism contends that real liberation of peoples occurs beyond the level of global politics and state sovereignty to include the individual level of being, of feeling and knowing. It entails decolonizing gender, or what Lugones calls a lived transformation of the social. A major obstacle to this lived transformation is the disconnect between self-determination and gender. espousing the idea that self-determination cannot be understood as distant from gender relations. Decolonial feminism stresses the importance of examining gender power hierarchies inherent in present-day post-independence society and the relationship between self-determination and gender violence. Drawing on Timorese women's perspectives, I suggest that key to this relationship is the role of gender. In the remainder of the paper, I offer some insights from the study into the role of gender, beginning with a brief overview of the context, post-independent Timor-Leste, where the interaction of an informal market economy, material poverty, and strong attachments to culture interact to pose serious challenges to gender equality and gendered healing. Predating and exacerbated by colonialism and violent conflict, gender inequality, poverty, and gendered violence are deep-rooted aspects of everyday life in Timor and remain severe and pervasive throughout the country. Despite the introduction of a raft of gender reforms accompanying the early phase of self-determination and independence, change in the private sphere has remained slow, with the gender division of labour and women's disproportionate care burden and unequal status compared to men scarcely shifting. Meanwhile, there is little outrage within society about the prevalence of gendered violence against women. In sum, the expansion of formal rights does not appear to be translating into actual gains for Timorese women in the post-independent period. One such reform imposed by international development is the state-led gender mainstreaming strategy, which is critiqued for bearing too little relevance within the lived realities of Timorese women. It mainly follows a top-down integrationist approach, relying on technical tools that draw on unidimensional and incomplete understandings of gender, disconnected and sometimes at odds with the local context. This type of intervention risks encountering the pitfalls well known to gender mainstreaming, where gender ends up being depoliticized, instrumentalized, and captured by competing sectoral ministries. In one of the narratives of an elected woman representative participating in my study, it became apparent that issues such as unpaid labour, women's care work within the family, and their struggles to provide for the family in context of severe poverty were not reaching the meetings of the SUCO councils, where it was purported that gender issues were to be considered as part of local development approaches. This was an important finding in my research because it demonstrated to me that the kind of gender that women were experiencing in everyday life was not being brought to the decision-making table or discussions where community life were being exposed. It is well established that Timorese society today is particularly influenced by a patriarchal gender order and a pluralistic system, combining state and non-state sources of power. Significant within this has been the revitalization of lisan and the return of pre-war gender norms that, fractured by violent conflict, privilege, militarized masculinity. They also insist on female subjugation and women's return to traditional domestic maternal roles. However, there has been a tendency within orthodox development processes in Timor-Leste to neglect the socio-cultural, historical, and affective dimensions of local context and everyday ways of being. This, the scholarship, Timorese women's groups, has generated according to them, an inadequate understanding of gender specificity, reinforcing essentialized concepts of gender. This is invisibilizing issues that are important to women, ignoring inconvenient realities of their family and married lives, ultimately reinforcing their subjugation and vulnerability to gender harms. Sidelining complex hierarchies or keeping issues such as women's poverty and unpaid labour off the policy table neglects structural problems underlying gender inequality. So it stands to reason creating knowledge about gender and how we do this matters deeply if we are to inform policy intending to transform the social. To attempt this, I sought out the perspectives of Timorese women about their everyday lives using a qualitative methodology across 2 urban and 2 rural villages in Dili and Loughton districts. Driven by their voices, my study focused on the gender poverty violence nexus, or the interrelationship between gender poverty and violence. Specifically, what kind of role gender might be playing in shaping the manner in which women's care relations are normalized and become exploitative and violent. My study drew on a definition of gendered poverty as extending beyond material deprivations, include women's disproportionate care burden, unequal power and inferior status in the household as compared to men. It took as the following definition of gendered interpersonal violence: a continuum of multiple interrelated and sometimes recurring forms of physical, sexual and psychological and emotional violence, and economic abuse and exploitation experienced in a range of settings from the public to the private. To break open this gender poverty violence nexus, my study combined a multi-level ecological framework with a theory of gender and power, which I analysed using a 2x2 dimensional framework, namely gender poverty and motherhood and gender-based violence and marriage. Whilst it is well beyond the scope of the paper to discuss the analysis of the nexus in any great depth or nuance, a very brief overview of its key elements tell us the following. Firstly, the onus for caring and dealing with poverty was highly feminized, with accounts such as the following replete across all 4 communities participating in my study. For example, focus group discussants in one rural village told me how when we compare our jobs with men's, well, things are not the same. As women, we have to do much more work than men. We have to cook, wash clothes, clean the house, prepare the lunch, which men do not. And we have to find time to earn money and work alongside men in the fields. All this to make sure our families survive. Meanwhile, Lorenza, a housewife and mother of 5, explained to me that when we have no money, we cannot buy anything to feed the family. So then the stress comes and forces me, like other women, to be always thinking and worrying about where the next meal is going to come from. It falls on women to provide and worry. The second element of this gender poverty violence nexus that appeared was that Timorese women seem to have had little choice to accept their gendered roles and responsibilities and their disproportionate burdens of care and unequal access to decision making in the family, despite the amount of work that they do. As explained by Belbina, cooking and washing as women, we have to do all these things before our husbands come back from home. We have to clean all the things and have them ready for them. As women, these are things I have to do in our home. I must stay in my home, do my jobs as a wife and woman. Meanwhile, in focus group discussion, discussants told me that women suffer. We are poor. We have nothing and many children. And why? Because men depend on their wives to always let it be. We suffer as a consequence of marriage. We suffer because we have few rights and big responsibilities to take care of children, because this is what men expect from us. Women never feel happy with their husbands because we're always suffering, always pregnant, and always having to follow men's orders. Ella, a housewife, explained to me that the woman does not have the choice. I am the one that suffers. It's a big sacrifice trying to manage everything, from bearing children, rearing children, and always trying to make sure we have enough money. Regarding their domestic and care work as grueling, focus group discussions from one village were very articulate about the fact that women had no choice but to take care of the family, telling me whether we like it or not, as mothers and wives, we have to take care of the family. Celestina, a university student, highlighted internalization of this duty and obligation, telling me, well, as for who told the woman she has to stay at home, she believes it herself, that she has to do it. It comes from herself. I feel that this is a traditional decision. I also don't know why there are decisions like this in our community. Moving to the third element of this complex gender poverty violence nexus pervading women's everyday lives, it is apparent that instead of reaping the reward and the benefits for their work, Timorese women's status seemed to remain one of subjugation as they continued to suffer exploitation in the home, which often evolved into gender-based violence. Participants' narratives were replete with examples of how masculine privilege bestowed husbands with control over household assets and financial decision-making. In every study site, husbands were set to withhold their own income and control women's income by either appropriating it or compelling women to hand over their income to them. Sedaliza, a single mother, viewed her friends as worse off than herself, as these women, in addition to the drudgery involved in caring and providing for women, or providing for children rather, also had to contend with managing difficult and often non-earning husbands and power imbalances that increased vulnerability to violence. Women not only had to compensate financially for husbands' refusal to work, but were also compelled to hand over their earnings or directly finance their recreational activities. Least they faced marriage tensions that often escalated into violence. Eldina's powerful account next exposes normalized gender power relations, what happens to women's income, and how marriage inequalities render women's earning capacity redundant in terms of their status in the family, whilst also increasing their vulnerability to GBV. She told me how men's power affects women's lives, like here in the suko. In the family, women work. In some cases, the husbands take the money off their wives and take control of it. The money, you know, it is important for the family. If the wives try to hold on to it, they get beaten. That is what happens to most women in the suko. If a woman has a job, and so does her husband, the woman hands over whatever she earns to him. He manages the money directly, making all decisions about how it is to be spent. Fourth, GBV was not only common, but also expected and accepted feature of women's poverty, family, and married lives. A great many of the women's stories were replete with accounts of gendered violence that was mostly described as routine and often severe. Like many others, Philomena, a housewife and mother of 8, blamed poverty for her experiences of routine violence, telling me that besides the food, he also gets violent when I don't have his laundry ready. If I challenge him, he responds by punching or beating me. It's just that our living conditions are so bad, it's hard to get anything done. Meanwhile, Angela, an elected woman representative, drew on gender norms and expectations of the good wife and the good woman to rationalize husbands' behavior and legitimize and make acceptable violence against their wives. Women, she told me, the woman is obliged to prepare food for the family. But this does not always happen. And why? Because women just sit around in front of the house and do nothing except spread rumours about other women's lives. If a woman just sits around doing nothing all day, not even preparing food for the family, then of course the husband will get angry. And of course, then what happens? Violence. And he goes off, gets drunk, and has affairs and gets into trouble. Another elected woman representative exposed the narrative acceptance of gender-based violence in the home, telling me, well, if domestic violence happens inside the home, well, maybe that is okay, because they will forgive each other. Fifth and final aspect of the complex gender poverty violence nexus was that an overwhelming majority of the women who participated in my study adapted to GBV and found it extremely difficult to envision and pursue a safe and secure route out of violent marriages. Katarina, a mother of 8 from an urban village, told me that my husband beats me when we are angry with each other. Just stay patient. I have so many children. As a family, we have to remain patient. Indeed, wives' obedience to husbands featured regularly in stories about marriage and women having to stay in violent marriages. In one focus group discussion, women explained that women must obey husbands. This is a consequence of marriage. She agreed to it when she married. She has no rights in marriage. Her husband has all the power. Rosa, an elected woman representative in a rural suco, told me, I'm really worried about some women because they are too patient. Even when their husbands are violent towards them. They just stay quiet and obey their husbands, doing whatever they are told to do. That's because in our culture, women have to obey their husbands. Lamina, a mother of 8, told me the violence comes in slaps. When he's very stressed, he slaps me. I am not afraid. I am not happy. Things go back to normal. We just keep it within the family. We never go to the police or the Sheffield Suco to talk about the problems. It's a family problem, so I just solve it within the family between me and my husband. I just leave it. She also told me that I come far away from Dili. I moved to Dili when I married. I have no one here. I have nowhere to go. I have no choice but to stay here now. Listen and follow. My family are good people, but they do not like me because of my husband. I have a sister living the other side of town, but my husband won't let me visit her. Earlier in the paper, I proposed reflecting on the gender poverty violence nexus to find out how decolonial processes might be transforming patriarchal institutions in Timor-Leste, and what kind of potential this has for gender justice and healing, and a holistic realization of self-determination. Whilst it is beyond the scope of the paper to present the analysis of this complex nexus, I will sketch out a few insights into the role of gender in the social construction and intractability of gender violence in women's lives. Briefly, insights suggest key processes involving the relationality of marriage and motherhood with gender poverty and violence, where marriage and motherhood emerged as the two most salient constructs appearing to turn women's households into a bearer of gender, serve patriarchal interest, and engender women's relational vulnerabilities. Next was the interaction or the intersectionality of women's subjective roles of wife and mother with socio-cultural norms, women's immediate environment, and Timor-Leste's socio-economic context. There are indications that Timorese social norms, not least cathexis and the gender division of labour and power underlying women's maternal activities and the gender organisation of family life, were resulting in an unequal setting for them. This was feminising caring obligations to the disadvantage of women, and also compelling women to accept inordinate workloads and burdens, and increasing their vulnerability to affective inequality exploitation. Also exacerbating the situation was women's immediate environment, namely marriage equalities and family circumstances that interacted with the conflict-affected context, characterized by underdevelopment, informalization, and male unemployment. Feeding into the web of gendered obligation, exploitation, control, and violence was gender, expressed in the form of thwarted masculinities and ambivalent femininities, kinship, and the vitality of Imalaran and Imalur, the public-private divide, and in particular, the institution of marriage. These interacted with the wider conflict-affected context, particularly the informal economy, emerging as key instruments sustaining women's subordination and vulnerability to gender-based violence. To sum up, my attempt at contributing towards a decolonial understanding of gender recognizes and deconstructs the links between affective gender inequality and gendered violence. This implies making care visible in development paradigms as the foundation of relational being, of living well together and in peace. Decolonizing gender research, development, and self-determination can only be achieved with an epistemological turn that overtly seeks to destabilize hegemonic systems that constitute patriarchy and eradicate all forms of colonial exploitation underlying Timorese society and lived realities. This entails acknowledging temporal and spatial patriarchal continuities and all its harms, which I argue is critical if we are to advance accountability and justice for gender harms and crimes taking place in peace and wartime. Thank you.
Thank you, Kiliuna. So because the time is running out quickly, we just move to the next two presenters, and then we have question and answers at the same time at the end of the session. So we go back to the we come back to the sexual slavery issue during the wartime. Eriko Ikeda and Mina Watanabe both are active here for the museum, Women's Active Museum on War and Peace. Sorry, we call it WAM usually. So three of us are here in WAM. And Eriko is the honorary director of the WAM, and Mina is the director of the WAM currently. Something special about Eriko is Eriko met with Shanana in 1994, in Indonesia. No, 1991, before he was arrested, yes. But he was arrested in 1992, so it must be 1991. And Eriko used to work for the NHK, Japan Broadcasting Corporation, as director, and she made a number of programs on human rights issues and on East Timor too. So, so he worked with the Max Stahl, and met with Shanana, interviewed Shanana before. Okay, so she will talk about that. But she has a very brief message on this issue. And then Mina will talk about the international dimension of the solidarity movement for survivors. Okay, じゃあ池田さんよろしくお願いいたします。
はい。Thank you. My name is Eriko Ikeda. My title is Struggle to Reveal the Suffering. 大丈夫ですか？音これ？Suffering of comfort women and the Timor-Leste government. The message of Dr. Denis Mukwege is perhaps still fresh in everyone's mind. He received the 2018 Nobel Peace Prize for treating victims of sexual violence in his country, the Democratic Republic of Congo. He reminded the world that systematic sexual violence had become a weapon of war and alarmed conflict. But let's recall when the world began to seriously face up to wartime sexual violence as a violation of human rights of women. It was in the early 1990s. The beginning was former comfort woman Miss Kim Hak-sung from the Republic of Korea, who in 1991 came out and said that she was a victim of the Japanese military's comfort woman system. Her coming out then gave courage to victims from other Asian countries to stand up. They began to sue the Japanese government for reparation. Among those who raised voices in issue, East Timorese victims were the latest. East Timorese came out with testimonies just before the Women's International Tribunal of War Crimes that was held in December 2000. Two East Timorese women, Abo Marta Abubere and Abo Esmeralda Boe, spoke at the tribunal, bravery and determinedly. Their unwavering attitudes impressed the audience. I recall the joyful faces they showed when the guilty verdict was delivered to Emperor Hirohito. When I was still a director of the Japanese Broadcasting Corporation, or NHK, I visited Timor-Leste three times. Two of them were to report on the situation of Timor-Leste, where 1/3 of the population was said to have perished under Indonesian occupation. At that time, I wasn't really conscious of the painful past of comfort women of the Japanese army. In July 1991, I traveled to Dili, pretending to be a tourist, and conducted a secret interview with wanted resistance leader Shanana Gusmao. The interview was supposed to be a major news, but it was not broadcast because the NHK feared possible accusation about breaching Indonesian media regulations. However, 4 months later, the massacre of 12 November occurred, and my interview with Shanana was finally aired on the television, condemning killings and tortures by the Indonesian military and asking for help to the international community. Shanana was eloquent and resolute. After attaching world attention by this tragedy, the Timor-Leste subsequent saga is now what we all know well. Timor-Leste restored sovereignty in May 2022, and Shanana became the president. However, to our disappointment, the resistance hero began to comment on acts of testifying of the survivors of wartime sexual violence as sad and shameful. In January 26, I attended a public hearing on comfort women held in Dili. Representatives from the organizing group went to the presidential office to have an audience with him. But I heard that when the video of the Women's International War Crime Tribunal in Tokyo was handed over to him, he said, "Please do that somewhere else, not in East Timor-Leste." I was puzzled. At the times of the struggle, Timorese leaders like Shanana Gusmao condemned Indonesians of oppression and human rights violation against his people. Why now do they refrain from criticizing Japan after their country has achieved independence? Do they think it would embarrass Japan as a major aid donor? It is through the attitude of Asian government toward the problem of comfort women, very depending on their diplomatic relations with Japan and the economic assistance they received from Japan. But Timor-Leste has a legacy of a long struggle for justice. I still have hope, therefore, that the government of Timor-Leste once again will show us their courage to demand an official apology and reparation from the Japanese government. Thank you.
Thank you, Eriko Ikeda-san. Yes, it's a question whether Shanana changed his mind after independence, or he didn't change. That's why he's saying so. Or we don't know. You know, it's a question we want to ask. じゃあ、皆さん, please go ahead. Your turn.
I will share the
screenshot.
Can you see the slides? Okay. なんか I can't see me って感じだけど。Okay. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and hello everyone online. And let us quickly introduce ourselves. Hello. We are with Eriko, the previous speaker, and other colleagues. We established the Women's Active Museum One Piece, or ONE for short, in August 2005 with donation mainly from people in Japan. WAM is a museum especially focusing on violence against women in war and conflict situations, with particular focus on the issue of Japan's military sexual slavery, the so-called Kung Fu Women issue. WAM holds exhibitions, archives testimonies and evidence, conduct fact-finding projects, and makes actions in solidarity with the victims, survivors of conflict women. Today, I'd like to briefly share the history of the movement to bring justice for the victims, survivors, Kung Fu women system in the Asia-Pacific region. Please note that I will use the term Kung Fu women and Kung Fu stations in quotation marks. Though there's no comfort for victims, I retain these terms, which have historical significance, given that this euphemism was also used during the war. First of all, I'd like to show a map of Kung Fu Station which visualizes the magnitude of Japan's military sexual slavery system. The location of Kung Fu Station have been identified from official documents and the testimonies of survivors, former soldiers, and witnesses. The yellow line shows the outer limit of territory invaded by the Japanese military. The map confirms that the practice was widespread throughout the Asia-Pacific region. After Japan's defeat, women and girls were released or abandoned. Some managed to return home while others stayed in the area of their capture. For nearly all, a life began of a struggle against poverty, physical disease, psychological trauma, and community alienation. In Asia, many women also suffered from another armed conflict or dictatorship in the post-war period. This made it difficult for women victims to talk about the sexual violence they suffered at the hands of foreign military in the past war. In 1991, Ms. Kim Hak-sun, a Kung Fu women survivor from the Republic of Korea, heard on TV that the government of Japan said Kung Fu women were run as private brothels with no military involvement of the time. This motivated Ms. Kim to testify about her experiences and to file a lawsuit against the Japanese government for apology and compensation. News of Kim coming out spread through many parts of Asia, encouraging not only survivors from Republic of Korea, but also those from the Philippines, Taiwan, China, DPRK, Malaysia, Indonesia, and East Timor to talk about their ordeal. The coming out of the survivors led the Japanese historian Yoshimi Yoshiaki to conduct research on official documents in the Library of National Institute for Defense Studies in the then Japan Defense Agency, where he eventually located several tens of relevant official documents. The loss by the survivors also led the government of Japan to initiate their own fact-finding. At the end of World War II, the Japanese government systematically burned official documents in order to evade prosecution by the Allied forces. However, the Kung Fu women practice had been so systematic that it was not possible to burn all the relevant materials. The authorities had to declassify almost 300 documents archived in ministries. In August 1993, the Chief Cabinet Secretary Yohei Kono made a statement and acknowledged the involvement of Japan's military in the Kung Fu women's system. The Kono statement declares that Kung Fu stations were operated in response to the request of the military authorities of the day. It notes, in many cases, they were recruited against their own will and that they lived in misery at Kung Fu stations under the coercive atmosphere. However, the government refuses to acknowledge legal responsibility for the victims, saying that San Francisco Peace Treaty and bilateral agreements signed after World War II resolved the issue. The 1990s was also the decade when the women's rights movement against violence against women gained momentum. In 1993, the UN General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, while the 1995 UN World Conference on Women in Beijing adopted a platform for action which made women and armed conflict a strategic area of concern. UN special rapporteurs, such as the one on violence against women, also took up the Kung Fu women issue and published reports. The International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda was set up in 1993 and 1994, respectively. And both tried cases of rape and sexual slavery. To end impunity for violence against women in conflict situations, women's NGO was successful in having rape and sexual slavery included as war crimes and crimes against humanity in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court in 1998. The testimony of the comfort women survivors provided invaluable contribution to the elements of sexual slavery included in the Rome Statute. However, the Rome Statute does not apply retroactively. The Kung Fu women survivors' demands are simple: fact-finding, full acknowledgement of facts, official apology, prosecution of the perpetrators, legal compensation for damage, providing history education, and erecting memorials to ensure non-repetition. None of them are fully implemented even now, but the most lacking element had been the prosecution of the perpetrators in Japanese movement. In February 1994, 27 Korean Kung Fu women survivors and their supporters tried to submit criminal complaint to the Tokyo District Public Prosecutor's Office in order to have that office initiate a criminal investigation into prosecution for the Kung Fu women's system. Without explanation, however, the office refused to even receive the letter of complaints. This picture, entitled "Punish those responsible for the sake of peace." Ms. Kang Jok-hyun, a Kung Fu women survivor from South Korea, painted this picture in 1995. While attention is invariably focused on the victims of sexual violence who are asked to give a detailed account of their sexual suffering, the perpetrators remain untouched for the crimes. Although raped by numerous soldiers, survivors did not know who made the system. These survivors wanted to see the faces of the men who were responsible for their suffering. In December 2000, the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal on Japan's military sexual slavery was held by the Global Civil Society in Tokyo. This People Tribunal was premised on the understanding that law is an instrument of civil society that does not belong exclusively to governments. Accordingly, when states fail to exercise their obligation to ensure justice, civil society can and should step in. It proceeded as if it were reopening or continuation of RMTFE, the Tokyo trial after World War II, which had failed to prosecute those responsible for the system of sexual slavery. A country-based prosecutor team was formed from 10 countries, including East Timor, along with 2 international prosecutors. The East Timorese survivors, Esmeralda Boye and Malta Abele, broke the long silence for the first time. Through a 3-day proceedings, the Women's Tribunal tried to make clear not only the damage suffered, but also who were responsible for the system of sexual slavery committed by the Japanese military. 1 year later, the tribunal judgment was delivered in The Hague, the Netherlands. The judges found 10 high-ranking officials guilty of crimes against humanity for their responsibility in Japan's military sexual slavery system. One of these was Emperor Hirohito. The power of the tribunal lay in its capacity to examine evidence, develop an accurate historical record, and apply principles of international law to the facts presented. One of the purposes of establishing our museum was to preserve the testimonies and documents accumulated during the 3 years of tribunal preparation. The wounds and the scars of the survivors seem to heal somewhat when they feel the civil society understand them, but we feel the scabs are torn from old wounds and bleeding starts again when the government of the perpetrating country denies what really happened. On March 1st, 2007, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe denied publicly the forcible recruitment of comfort women. While there were denials by other leading politicians, it was especially shocking that an incumbent prime minister denied the sexual enslavement by the Japanese military that had been acknowledged throughout the world. Survivors in the Asia-Pacific strongly resented and were deeply distressed by the revisionism of the perpetrating country, Japan. This is a picture of Filipino survivors protesting in front of the Japanese embassy in Manila with a signboard saying, "I was forced," or "PM Abe liar." Prime Minister's denial prompted resolution by foreign national assemblies throughout 2007, including the US House of Representatives, the House of Commons of Canada, and the European Parliament, initiated by activists and human rights NGOs. Each called on the government of Japan to acknowledge sexual slavery and to apologize to victims unreservedly. The treaty bodies of UN International Human Rights Conventions also reacted. 6 major UN human rights institutions, such as Human Rights Committee, CEDAW, or CAT, have made recommendations to Japan on the comfort women issue. The issue of unfulfilled rights for reparation to victim survivors comfort women is understood as an ongoing human rights violation rather than a violation in the past in these committees. As one of the actions against revisionism by the Japanese government, activists and scholars nominated the documents related to the comfort women to the UNESCO Memory of the World Register. This is a photo of the signing ceremony in May 2016. You can see the one from the East Timor, and like you can see me and all other from 8 countries. And this is, as you can see, the nominators are from 8 countries and regions, and several national archives permitted us to nominate the comfort women related documents. More than 2,000 documents were nominated under the name of the Voice of Comfort Women. However, the government of Japan openly opposed this civil initiative to register the Voice of Comfort Women with UNESCO. When Prime Minister Abe heard of this initiative in May 2015, he stressed that it is important to start making all-out efforts now so as not to get these materials registered in memory of the world. Refusing to learn from its own past aggression, Japan rather adopts policies that whitewash history on every possible occasion. In 2017, Japan, as a top contributor to UNESCO, in the absence of the United States, suspended its contribution of $34 million. In October 2017, presumably as a result of Japan's pressure, UNESCO left the registration of our documents pending for dialogue. Since that time, the process has stalled. The Kung Fu Women Museum movement by civil society is now spreading throughout Asian countries. There are 4 museums in South Korea, 2 in China, 1 in Taiwan, 1 in the Philippines, and 1 in Japan. 75 years has passed since Japan's defeat. The survivors are already in their 80s and 90s, and we hear the news of their passing away every year. In order to remember their invaluable struggles and to prevent recurrence, a variety of activities are taking place, such as making movies or erecting memorials. We must not allow the second erasure from history of women's suffering that was once invisible. Survivors strongly want their memory preserved and passed on to ensure that no one should ever again endure the suffering forced upon them. It is a constant struggle to hold the government accountable and to preserve the memory of sexual crimes committed by the military of one's own country. But we must for that. It is our responsibility to the next generation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mina. So now we have heard all the presentations in this session, and now we go for question and answer. I think we don't have enough time, but anyway, I haven't seen any questions coming out in the chat. So now, if you have a question, please raise your hand. We directly go to the question.
Hannah.
Hmm?
Yeah,
Hannah, please. Yes.
Okay, sure. I have a couple, but I might just ask one for now. My question was for Nana Manuela. You talked about the recommendations of the CAVR and the CTF in terms of memorialization marking and sites of women's human rights. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what your thinking is around that, which sites, you know, where, what kind of memorialization do you envisage taking place here?
Okay, Manuela, so the question is about memorialization. Which sites do you think are important in terms of women's struggle survivors point of view? Is that the question?
Yes. Okay. Yes. So far, the memorialization, like what people usually, not people, like until now, the memorialization was done also, particularly for the important places like in Dili, the harbor, Santa Cruz, and another in the district, like more or less like for the big true people in Timor-Leste think that this is important. But for women's like memorialization to remember women's suffering, still not too much. But just in CNC now, but the former prison Invalidi, they have Shega exhibition here that we also have, like, they also have one room particularly to talk about women's story, women's suffering, And like now, our organization and other like try to identify and visit the places that people, women's was sufferer or the old prison or the place that was used to detain women there, like in sorry, in Colmera, sorry, Marina, Toko Marina, and all the clinic is Clinica Kartikasari, like the place that people, women was detained there, and also there's some places at the Colmera houses that usually the Indonesian military use a house to detain women and also brought the women to do sexual violence there. I think, yeah, now we started to do this, like together with CNC also, how to discuss about the commemoration or the memorialization, how to give respect or to, I don't know how to say in English, to give, to remember women's suffering. For example, also in some commemoration, we invite victims as survivors to talk about the story directly to the students, to the people. Thank you.
Okay.
Is it respond your question? Sorry.
Okay, pot 2, please.
I just want to have one question to Malina, right?
Manuela?
Manuela, sorry. So one question. In your presentation, you explained that the society is not accepting this comfort woman, that they're actually a victim of war. How the church act on it, and then how far do you make a a connection with the church, because I assume they can't educate their people, the follower, that this is not, they're pure, they've been forgiven by God, because well, some priests say that, but how far this is spread around Timor by the church, and how far they accept. That's one thing. Secondly, do you think this is also an exploitation, because when they're not pure, they don't have right of ownership? So this is something very structural. And thirdly, I will just say it's a comment, but anyone can comment back on this. But I think it's always happened with the newly independent state, when in the beginning, in the beginning of the independent, they will make an agreement with the woman that we will fight for you, that you are one of us, let's start this together. There's no differences between male, female, we are all Timorese. Or just in the case of Indonesia, in the beginning of early Independence Day, early Independence Day in East Indies in Indonesia, the same things happened. So the Indonesian woman movement is part of the nationalist movement, but once they get the power, the deal is not really there. And the comfort woman is here as well, right? So I think it's here. It's also a colony, but then it's kind of just forgotten. So maybe you can reflect back on it. Just a comment. Thank you.
Okay, two questions. One is what's the church doing in the case of women suffering, and the second one is the well, usual betrayal of the nationalist movements about women. You know, when they get independence, they easily forget the women's with their promise. Okay, Manuela.
Yeah, thank you. I think to talk about what the position or what Charles see about this, I think I was working for Focus since the beginning. I think at the time was very difficult. The Charles also, like in some places, they also not give permission for the women to go and to take the communion. This has happened in the early 2000 until 2004, and we have to talk to the priests and explain about this and how to make them aware that this is not the women's fault. But like until now, it still happen like in some churches that they ask if they want to baptize or to give the certificate of baptize. They ask for the father names. But now, like we already talked to them, like explain, not explain, but we talk, discuss about what happened to these women, because before, because the women keep silent, people don't know about what happened to them, because people just blame them because they see from far that, okay, these women want to be soldier's wife. But because we don't know about the story, but after some women speak out about the experience, people became aware and support. For example, in Baucau, we have like the victims from Flamboyant. From the before they know about the story, all the communities blame them. They say this is a prostitute. They are soldiers' wife. But after we approached them, even between the victims, they discriminate each other. Like if we have a meeting and we invite them, and they say, "Oh, we are victim," but they are not a victim because they are prostitute. Because why they have if they don't want the soldier, why they have 4 children for different fathers? Because they don't know the story. But now, like there are many women start to talk about the story. Even some of them talk openly in TV, like example of sorry, Mana Maria from Baucau. She was yeah, we went to lobby. Sorry. Sorry. Yeah, we lobby the bishop, and we have a short video about Maria. The title of this Feto Flamboyant, Women in Flamboyant Hotel. This is a good film, but also the good process that we approach the priest, the Bishop Basilio, and he also agreed to do the film at the church, and we had some good picture that when they have to not reconcile, but shake hands each other. And this is like the first time Bishop of the church agree to do film video for these women.
Who is the
like
bishop? Sorry, who is
Bishop
the bishop?
Basilio. Yeah.
Okay.
You can see the video we have in our line. Sorry. Public ne bilhare video ne. Della Harebe film, sorry. Hi Harebe. YouTube, sorry. You can access from YouTube. Hotel Flamboyant, the title. And talking about the exploitation to the women. Sorry, I don't got this problem, but the question. But I just want to answer about the time when the people the struggle period. Yeah, many of the women and men say that they are unity and struggle together to get independence. But in reality, after after independence, for example, for women themselves, the women that became parliament, some of them also criticize about this, about they don't trust to these women that say they are victims of sexual slavery or sexual rape case, because they say if you have these children, it means you want, and they are not support. I think until now we still deal with this betrayal, public betrayal from the executive or for the parliament members, that they don't care about this, because if they want, we have a big number of women, and we have also many friends that now they are as a member of parliament. They're supposed to support, because we are in the same line before struggle for human rights, for women's rights. Sorry.
Okay. Well, we're supposed to finish soon, but I found now there are a number of questions in chat. One question is about Japan. How can Japan restore reputation by sincere apology? How can these sincere scholars influence the Japanese government to do so? Watanabe-san, 答えられる? How can we?
Please, scholars, please answer. We are activists.
Sorry. Aki,
Hey.
may I ask something? May I say something to Pocket? Add some comments to Pocket? It's okay?
Yeah, but yeah. Briefly, please.
Yeah, briefly. Okay. Manuela, I congratulate your effort to make advocacy and have a dialogue with the church people, the Catholic Church. It's very important. It's very important. And we tried before. We also tried the same things to the church. I talked with the Bishop Basilio twice or so, and in 2006, when we held the public hearing on the issue of comfort women during the wartime, the Bishop Basilio, Bishop Ricardo agreed to pay opening speech, and he congratulates the survivors' courage to speak out what had happened to them. I think that we have to continue our dialogue, advocacy to with the Catholic Church, and this is one thing. And another thing is that we didn't look into the church history of Timor yet, but I heard. I got the information from one priest that there is the church, the book, the church history of Timor. And my idea is that, the information given to me that in that book, some sections written on the persecution, the church people, priests or the Lang people, during the wartime, during the occupation of Japanese time. So I think this could be a kind of a common ground to starting our joint work together with the Catholic Church to have a some kind of advocacy within the church. So next time when I can go into the Timor, I have to go to the West Timor to look for the book, the church history, the book on church history. Okay, and okay, that's all. And
sorry, I'm lost.
Can we cut it off because time is running out.
Just contact you later.
Yeah.
I'll contact you later.
Okay, I think I have to answer the question raised by the UNTL Human Rights Center about how Japanese scholars can influence. Well, there are influential scholars, and there are scholars who are not influential like us. You know, so it's very difficult sometimes. So the politicians are divided. You know, but there are politicians who are sympathetic to this kind of issue, but the current government is under hardline nationalist group, so to say, so including Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, who is leaving the prime ministership soon. So it's a difficult situation now, and we're kind of a backlash here, and swing into the ultra right in the political scene of Japan. And then, so now I think we are now going through the winter period of this issue. So, but of course, the movement itself is very strong. We have lots of activists here, lots of movements, and the documentation is sufficient. And then proving that it is a crime, I think it's already enough. It's only, we only need the political will to move forward to address this issue. So the government must make measures, the government make an official apology and a compensation, justice, and so on and so on. But so far, the scholars, the honest scholars, haven't been able to influence the government enough because the government is very hard, very, very conservative at the moment. It's very difficult to move. Okay. And this is not only issue that divides the politicians. This is a part of the bigger issue, the war responsibility of Japan, whether Japan did wrong or not during the wartime. And there are questions to Cleonard. Did you see the chat? Okay, so can you answer the questions?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. And, you know, in the presentation of my findings today, I suppose what I really wanted to get through was the intractability, the stubbornness of gender norms and inequitable gender relations in Timor-Leste today. That whatever has been happening over the past 2 decades has not really been shifting, according to the participants in my study, the structures of power and domination. Perhaps, you know, at different times during the struggle for self-independence, there was a relaxation of gender norms. But over the past 2 decades, there is little evidence in my study to show that there was a real transformation of these gender norms that were oppressing Timorese women, exploiting Timorese women's labor, and exposing them to violence. In terms of your question regarding, you know, was there any evidence in my study of a decolonizing process? I have to say, you know, yes, of course there were glimpses of change in some of the women's stories. You know, it was very obvious that the women were frustrated and discontent. They had a consciousness, they have a critical consciousness that their position is you know, within the family, you know, their inferior position, that this is wrong, there's something wrong with this, that this is not just. You know, there was evidence in my study of women having very caring and loving husbands. There was evidence in the study of women having husbands who object to violence against women. But this was few and far between. You know, the vast majority of women's narratives were replete with examples of, you know, horrific forms of exploitation, drudgery, and violence. And you know, the elected women representatives themselves, in terms of their understandings of gender, you know, it was, you know, they expressed frustration around domestic violence as a consequence of women refusing to or not being able to live up to the expectations of motherhood and being a good wife. So I don't know, does that answer your question? Do you want to probe me a little bit more? I'm very willing to discuss more, talk more about my findings, that I wasn't able to get everything into my presentation today.
Yeah, thank you. I think your time's running out, so.
Yeah, I'm very sorry to interrupt, because really, I think the organizer is very anxious about when we are finishing this session. So the final question but we can continue in the bar if you can move to the bar. Do you know the place? Okay. The last question to Manuela. The coming out of Aboshira, the comfort women survivors, have a good impact on the coming out of survivors of the Indonesian time. Okay.
Pagi, maksudnya impact the survivors agoranya.
Sì, cada impatto positivo. Se Aboshira sai kolia, então ia impacto kalai ba sobrevivente di tempo Indonesia.
Yeah, I think this is they have a good positive impact, because like what we have done now, if the survivors, like the survivors from past conflict from the occupation time, if they talk bravely, openly, also motivate the victims of domestic violence. I think at the same time, like the victims from comfort women, because in some videos we also saw to them, this is like a good motivation, because they think that why these all women, they still have a courage to talk, and why we want to keep quiet, because they can motivate each other. This has happened in some places that still have some of us alive, like from Avo at Sabe. Yeah, some survivors there, they say that they know about Avo Ines, and they heard about why Avo can speak and go to speak to another country, and I think they can help. Like, this is a model of example for them, that this is not a bad thing, because before they just thought that if you talk about this, it's make you sane, embarrass you, or make your family more ashamed. But after they know that people can, if you talk about them, people know about the story, and they will more respect you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Manuela. I'm very sorry I couldn't manage the time well, but thanks to the speakers and the audience. Finally, we have arrived at the end of the session. I think the obvious conclusion is that there are too many things we have to do still. So we have no time to get affected by COVID-19. So we continue to fight. And then it's very good to continue communicating each other. I think if you contact me, then I can give you contacts with the participants also. Yeah. So someday we can meet somewhere, perhaps in Timor or somewhere else. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay. Deus.
Especially to Marissa, thank you very much for allowing us to continue the session until the end.
Paki.
Thank you, Professor Paki.
Open
Thank
your
you, Professor Marissa. Hello.
Hello.
We go.
Until later in the closing session. Don't forget the closing session will be on, and also the Sr. Diretor Fernandes will be talking.
It's going to be at the auditorium room.
It's already deeply dinner time in Japan, so I don't know.
Professor Marissa, the closing will be at the auditorium or should be in the room? Just want to check.
It's up to you, but in Instant Cultural, I don't know.
I'm going to be at my home. So how estamos si quarto 3, dele?
Auditorium, sorry. Thank you. Até logo.
Bye. I'm leaving tonight.
See you. Have a good night, Japan. Have a good dinner.
Bye. Thank you. Same to you.